Our speaker today is Susan Wilson, who some of you may be familiar with. She is a professional photographer and writer and has spoken here at Old South many times. We love her dearly. She's going to be talking again today about the literary trail of Greater Boston. And let's welcome Susan Wilson. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Can everyone see the screen? Because everything important is happening there. So I'm not blocking your view. You're cool? Because it's an awesome new screen and really big. And this is the debut, and I'm very proud to be making the debut with the new screen. I'm going to basically talk along with the slides. I'm going to involve you. If you thought you were going to get away with just listening, you're wrong. I will be asking you questions and finding out how much you know as well. And this is also very free-flowing. So as I'm talking about things or we're discussing things, if you have any questions, just raise your hand and I'll call on you. My lovely assistant will be running, Meredith will be running the projector, the brand new LCD projector. It's so high-tech here. And I just wanted to check, is the clock correct for timing? Is that... Okay, so it's 5 minutes later than that, and we should end in 45 or less. Okay, all right. So I wanted to introduce you to the Literary Trail of Greater Boston. It's a variety of things. It's not only the book, okay, by Commonwealth Editions, fresh off the presses, but it's also an actual trail in Boston. There are a variety of delightful trails in Boston. This is just the newest chapter. Many of you probably know the Freedom Trail was the very first, and that's over 50 years old now. That was started in 1951. The second one to come in was the Black Heritage Trail. The third one of significance was the Women's Heritage Trail, the Boston Women's Heritage Trail. Michelle Jenny, who's on the board, is here from the Boston Women's Heritage Trail. I'm on the board too. And the Literary Trail is one of the bevy of new trails that have been developed. It was kind of a no-brainer because when you think about all the things happening in Boston history, yes, the American Revolution was a very, very pivotal thing that started here. But 2 generations later, about a little more than 2 generations later, a literary revolution happened. And it began in America, in Massachusetts, very much like the political revolution had in 1775. So given that, and given that from 100 years before that and to the present day, Boston is such a significant educational and literary center, it was really probably only a matter of time before the idea came to have a literary trail. I'd like to take credit, but I can't. This was an outgrowth of a group called the Boston History Collaborative, which was groups of scholars and people from various sites and people from tourism, whatever, that got together and started brainstorming about 7 years ago what new trails might come because of the wealth of things in Boston history. And so this was one of the outgrowths of that. I was simply the person chosen to take this rough outline and flesh it out and make it into a full-fledged, easy for me to say, full-fledged trail. So that's what this is about, okay? And that's what the cover looks like. The inside, if anyone saw the version 5 years ago, which was smaller, and it's always nice to have a second chance. You can correct your errors, change your language, and add all kinds of new great things, which we were able to do. Also, the cover has a slight difference. It's now called The Literary Trail. If you have an old book, a very obscure fact, you can tell at a cocktail party. The old one was just called Literary Trail, but I really wanted that The. It gives kind of a validation. Okay. And it's very important to know Commonwealth Editions did the new one, and Commonwealth Editions is doing, you need to check them out, check out their website, come to these lectures. They are doing so many extraordinary books about New England and Boston history and are really committed to that, so it's very exciting. However, next slide. This originally came out with another publisher 5 years ago, who will go unnamed. However, they gave me a great story that I want to introduce this with. I was given a young female editor to work with me, and I started writing, and then eventually, when I was actually almost through, she said, I really want to see what you've written, and, nobody asked me questions before that, so I was just talking to all my friends, all the sites, everyone I knew who knew history, and getting ideas. And she came back to me and said, I really like it, but there's one big problem. You've included way too many women in this text, and besides, I haven't heard of a lot of them. Okay. I was very excited when she said this, because I hadn't realized I included that many women in the text. Most literary histories, and there have been many of them written, I have several books that are written even 100 years ago, have about one woman to every 35 men. And when my colleagues at the History Collaborative heard this and thought that she was going to go in and start deleting the women, they made a count, and it turned out that 1/3 of all the people in the book were women, and the other 2/3 are men, and she thought that was too many. And I went, well, maybe too many would be 60%, but I don't think 1/3 is too many. That's approaching equality. And as for the fact that she said she hadn't heard of them, I went, awesome. That's the point. Because who's going to write about them if we don't? And who's going to bring these people back? Many of whom were very, very famous in their time. But history is often about the people who write the history. And it's really only been in the past 20 or 30 years that women have taken an active role in writing history, and all kinds of other minorities, African Americans, Asian Americans, etc., and therefore bringing out things that got left behind as insignificant. So in honor of this editor, by the way, I won. In honor of this editor, I'm going to prioritize women on the literary trail today. Obviously, I'm going to include a lot of people, but the trail is so huge and has so many hundreds of various sites in it that I have to pick, and so I'm going to kind of prioritize that. Okay. Now, who's this? Phyllis Wheatley, okay. No-brainer. This woman didn't need me or anyone else to help get her out there. Phyllis Wheatley is maybe one of the most popular literary and human figures in Boston history. And gosh, she's the most popular person in this site here. Phyllis Wheatley being, can anyone tell me? One-liner, why we care about her other than we love her? Okay, not exactly. Firsts are all kind of iffy. First black woman author. She's actually the first published African-American poet. So there's a couple of little ifs in there. But in 1773, she, a member of the Old South Meeting House, published this book, which is world famous now and has gained her renown. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Phyllis Wheatley other than she's our cover girl and the person I want to start with. She did indeed arrive here in 1761 as a slave of approximately 7 years old. She didn't speak English. She got her name, since she couldn't speak English, from the name of the ship she came on, which was the Phyllis, and the family that bought her were the Wheatleys, and that's how she got her name, Phyllis Wheatley. She turned out to be very curious. The Wheatley children, the two children, taught her, even though she was a slave, found out that she wanted to learn how to read, to write, to do all kinds, to learn geography and foreign languages and everything they knew. So they taught her many things. So did the mother of the family, Susanna Wheatley, and they helped her to grow and to publish her first poems. Her very first poem, by the way, was to the minister of the Old South Meeting House who was sick, and I believe his name was Joseph Sewell, and it was called, of all things, to the Reverend Joseph Sewell when sick. The poems were odd then. Anyway, next slide. So Phyllis became very famous. You all know this display down in the corner. She's a major display, a major part of the education program now at the Old South. Okay, next. And she is a part of the wonderful new installation on the Commonwealth Avenue Mall between the Fairfield and Gloucester block. How many of you have seen this new memorial? Okay, if you haven't, get down there. It's awesome. Boston statuary for years was very male-oriented. In fact, for a long, long time, it was kind of a joke that the only two women depicted on public property and public statues in Boston were in front of the State House, Anne Hutchinson and Mary Dyer. One was banished, the other was hanged. And they were both in the 1600s also, but in the past decade there have been a flurry of, we've been making up for lost time. And this was installed a year ago, October, and includes, curiously enough, 3 women involved in literary pursuits. Does anyone know who the 3 are and what their literary pursuits were? Michelle. Abigail Adams in the center. What did she write? Remember the Ladies. Okay. Profuse correspondence with her husband, John Adams. And a lot of reminiscences from that time are based on her phenomenal letters and her trying to get women a role in the world. in America. It only took a little while. Okay, Michelle, who else is there? Lucy Stone. Who is Lucy Stone? Anybody? Things like that. Okay, Lucy Stone, as Michelle was saying, abolitionist women's right advocate. She was, her literary connection was she began a thing called the Women's Journal, which was actually the voice of one sector of the women's movement in the 1870s, and employed a lot of women trying to get the right to vote for women, which didn't exist in 1870. And the other curious thing is, as Michelle mentioned, she married Henry Blackwell. And decided in the marriage vows to have something which is not uncommon today, but to keep her own name, to keep her family name. And so if you did that thereafter, you were called a Lucy Stoner. And they had vows that had to do with that they were equals in their relationship, which was really weird in the 19th century. So she's phenomenal, was a very important part of literary and getting ideas about women's equality out. And then on the right is Phyllis Wheatley, of course, with her famous book and her poems. So it's great that one of the newest memorials in town is dedicated to literary women. Okay? And Phyllis is one of them. Yes? It's on Commonwealth Avenue Mall. It's right after Samuel Elliot Marcin. He's the guy on the boulder. Okay, another literary person who's in our book. It's between the Fairfield and Gloucester block. Okay, next. Okay, now, the newest Phyllis thing, because she is so cool, is that the Landmarks Orchestra, which is the orchestra that goes around and for the past several years has been playing for free in neighborhoods in a variety of places all over Boston and making classical music accessible to people who would not otherwise see it, have commissioned for this summer a piece called The Journey of Phyllis Wheatley. This was last week's fundraiser over at the Ritz-Carlton, and next slide. This will be making its free debut on July 17th, which is a Sunday, on the Boston Common. However, if it rains, it's going to be here, which is awesome. So try to make it either place. It'll be listed in the Globe and everywhere, but this is the newest piece dedicated to her. So it's really exciting that this woman of letters has become so big and so popular in Boston and around the world. Oh, the other thing is on July 15th, watch for another event introducing that happening here at the Old South. The details to be announced later. Okay. Now, another connection here to the Old South, because the Old South is a part of literary history because Phyllis was a member. By the way, she would have to sit back in the gallery because blacks were, even though she was a slave, and she was allowed to be a member here, but they were not allowed to sit with white people who were sitting down here, so she was allowed in but up there. But another person associated with this was Benjamin Franklin. Now, how many of you thought Franklin was from Philadelphia? Philadelphia likes to pretend. You did? Okay. Oh, come on. No one else thought that? Okay. All right, fine. Anyway, Ben Franklin was born right over there. You can see if you look out the back window, you can see his face back there. And he was quickly baptized here. And the reason I bring him up is, yes, of course, he was a great literary person. In fact, his autobiography, which was first published in 1791, has been published in dozens of languages, and it's also never been out of print since 1791, which is pretty amazing. But he started his literary career here when he was a kid. Next slide. That's not him as a kid, clearly. Okay, however, when he was a kid, okay, next slide. When he was 12 years old, he started working for his brother. His brother, James Franklin, ran a newspaper called the New England Courant, which I believe was the fourth newspaper ever in the British colonies in North America. If you go down Court Street, there's a little alley across from the public school building, and there's a little plaque there that shows where James Franklin ran his shop. And when Ben was 12 years old, he started working as an apprentice, and apprentices were treated extremely badly. He did all the bad stuff, cleaning type and dirty stuff and nothing interesting at all, cleaning, sweeping, bad hours. And even though it was his brother, he apparently resented him for the rest of his life. But he did meet a lot of writers, and he did get to read the paper and was very interested. His brother wouldn't let him write, so he wrote secretly. And what he would do is he would go home at night, And he started writing a column under the name of Silence Dogood, who was, here we have a woman writer, who was allegedly a woman. So he wrote as a woman's persona of a woman who was the widow of a minister from Harvard, Massachusetts, and wrote his opinions based on what he thought a woman from Harvard, Massachusetts would think. And he would slip them under the door at night. His brother read them and went, wow, this is really interesting. And it would talk about women's rights or the length of petticoats or education at Harvard or whatever he felt like talking about. And they were published for 6 or 7 months. So he actually made his debut before he was discovered as Silence Dogood in Boston. And then he split because he didn't like the Puritan ethic or, the repressiveness here. Next. Now, this has also, again, Old South has been a center of free speech for years. As you know, I believe this is John Hancock. I get these guys mixed up. This is from the annual Tea Party little festival that happens here every December. But free speech and people speaking and talking and famous authors writing here, not writing here, but reading here, have been all a part of the Old South history from the Revolution and before and to the modern day. Okay, here. And this is Howard Zinn speaking here, the author of the very popular People's History of the United States and a variety of other things. So people from left, right, and center have all spoken here, and it's just a major center. Important. Next slide, please. Okay. This is the quiz part. Okay, this is where I get to test what you know about Boston literary history, some more serious, some more whimsical. Here's our first question. Raise your hand if you can answer any part of it. What two women, both well known in American literature, may or may not be residing in colonial burying grounds on Tremont Street, Boston? Wait. Raise your hand. Yes. Ooh. Elizabeth Vergoose or Mother Goose. Excellent. And you had it, but you didn't raise your hand. Okay. And who's the other one? The other one is actually, this is tricky because she's a character in literature. Yes. Whoa. Okay. Way smart audience. Here we go. Elizabeth Payne, and here's the story. Okay, next slide. Good, guys. I'm impressed. There is, over in the King's Chapel burying ground, a stone that looks like this. Starting for sure in the 1920s, we've chronicled it that far back, it may have existed before, people started saying, you know what this is? Do you know what this is? That's an A. And some people say, oh, excuse me, that's not an A, but this is the legend, that this Elizabeth Payne was in fact, this gravestone was the inspiration for this woman, Hester Prynne in The Scarlet Letter. And we actually know, next slide, that Hawthorne, and he actually, I didn't have a younger picture of him, he was younger at the time, used to work in town. He got a job working at the Custom House because he wasn't able to make a living as an author at that time, as a customs inspector. But he loved wandering up and down the street. He would read and study at the Athenaeum. He would dine at the Parker House with the Saturday Club. And so he was a regular on this street. And according to Emerson, Hawthorne never really liked going into church, but he loved graveyards, and he would wander through graveyards all the time, and we know that he wandered through the one in King's Chapel. Now, whether or not that stone and the story of Elizabeth Payne, who supposedly was illegitimate, and there might have been kind of some parallel between her and Hester Prynne in The Scarlet Letter, whether that's true or not, if you go back and read the very last page of The Scarlet Letter, you will find a description of King's Chapel burying ground and a stone in there with an A on it. So is it not? I don't know. And that's why we say may or may not be. But it's a wonderful legend, so I love to tell it. Okay, so the other woman of literature, allegedly. Okay, here's the Granary burying ground. So we have two major burying grounds on Tremont, and this is the one that all the great patriots are in. Okay, this is where Paul Revere is and the guys killed in the Boston Massacre and Otis and Hancock, etc. However, many, many guidebooks have the following, and this is actually a page from a not-to-be-named guidebook. Okay? Mary Goose, wife of Isaac Goose, Boston's Mother Goose, is said to have written the nursery rhymes for her grandchildren. And I even have seen guides periodically go in, and this grave is there. You can go over and see it and say, look, here's Mary Goose, this is Mother Goose. Okay, what's the problem here? Well, first of all, it was Elizabeth, not Mary. What was their relationship? Okay, that's what you heard. Here's what I heard. Okay, that Isaac Goose married twice. Not uncommon in colonial times. Many women died in childbirth. Many children died in childbirth, and therefore it wasn't uncommon at all for someone to have a wife, the wife died, and they would get married way fast, because who wants to take care of 10 kids and be working at the same time? So, Mary Goose was Isaac Goose's first wife. Okay, so Mary Goose is there. Okay, no question about it. Now, again, Goose, we think it's a contraction of Vergoose, that they dropped the ver somewhere. Then he married Elizabeth Foster, and she became Elizabeth Foster Vergoose. Okay? Supposedly, Mary and Isaac had 10 kids. Okay, and then when Elizabeth married, she was taking care of those 10 kids, and she and Isaac had another 5 or 6, depending on what you hear. Now, if you had 15 or 16 kids, wouldn't you tell them stories? Okay, so we think that that was what was happening, okay? Some versions of this, because there's not a lot of fact here, is that they were her grandchildren. So it was either her children or grandchildren. However the fact, as the story goes, her son-in-law, Thomas Fleet, who was indeed a printer, in 1719 assembled all these different stories she was telling them, and since everyone called her Mother Goose because she was Mrs. Goose, that they printed them, and it was Mother Goose's Rhymes for Children, and this was the original. Here are the problems with this alleged fact. Number one, as we already said, Mary is there, okay, but she's not Mother Goose. She couldn't be. And Elizabeth may or may not be buried there, but we don't know, okay, because there is no stone. So it's unclear whether she's there. That's not her grave, okay? The second thing is there are many stories about this volume, but there is not even one extant volume. That's kind of hard if you don't even have one and say, here is the book. So it may be a legend. We don't know. The book may not exist. And for the third point here, both the British and the French claim that Mother Goose came from there. And they have people that are called Mother Goose, both in English history and in French history. And many of the rhymes we know today that are included in Mother Goose's rhymes are translated from things that can be proven to have been printed there first. So this is a way iffy thing, but gosh, it's in every guidebook still. Okay? All right, good answers, guys. You got it basically. Okay, the next one. Whoops. Are we okay? All right, this is one of my favorites. This is about two women who wrote lyrics. Okay? In 1949, Bess Hawes and Jackie Steiner wrote a song about a mishap on America's first subway system. What was the song, and why was it written? Yes. The MTA song. How many of you were thinking that? Charlie and the MTA? Okay, good. All right. So here's what happened. Go ahead. This, by the way, I love this picture. Boston did have the first subway system, of one of the many famous firsts in Boston, and in 1897 we had the first underground subway. The thing is, it didn't exist as it did today. We had trolley lines all over the place, and when it opened in 1897, only 0.6 of a mile was underground. Okay, it started at the Park Street station, went by Boylston, and then, you know where the Unitarian Church is, and the Channing statue on the corner of Arlington and Boylston? The train came out there. That was it. That was the subway, okay? Obviously, it expanded over the years, but those 0.6 of a mile were the original subway, and this is that corner. So that would be where Channing is now, and this is the corner where it came out. And one very neat thing, if you're into subways, is to go to that corner, and you can still see the pavement where it was paved over when they continued the line and, you know, started adding the other lines, but you can still see the fill. They have never really covered it where that came out. Anyway, that's just the history of the subway. However, what happened was, in 1949, there was a man named Walter O'Brien who was running on the Progressive Party ticket for the mayor of Boston. And I believe he was running against John Hines at the time. And Walter O'Brien was a progressive. In 1949, that means he's a communist, okay, or considered a communist, because he believed in just horrendous things like blacks and whites together being in school, you know, women having equal opportunities in the school systems, just crazy commie things. So what happened was Bess Hawes, whose middle name, by the way, is Lomax, of the Lomaxes, who are very famous in musicology and folk history, she and Jackie Steiner got together and decided to write a song for Walter, because one of the things he was advocating is there was this new fare instigated on the MTA. At the time it was MTA. Today it's MBTA. It's different but the same. And there was an exit fare. So you actually had to, because some people have said, well, wait a second. If he's already on the train, how come he can't get off? But it's because to get off, they instituted this thing where you had to pay an extra nickel on the way out. Okay, and that's why he couldn't get off the train. Here's the next slide shows the cartoon in Life magazine that ran about Charlie and the MTA, and there's his wife bringing him the sandwich because he can't get off the train. He'll never return. No, he'll never return. So the next slide, I had the grand opportunity in 1996 to track down both Walter O'Brien and Jackie Steiner. And this is them in their home, and there's Walter. They're holding the original record, which was recorded by them, way back in 1949, and it's in old 78, and they would go around in a van with a megaphone on the top and, play this thing and go through the streets of Boston playing this song, Charlie and the MTA. In 1959, the version you probably know was recorded by the Kingston Trio, and because there was still it's still the Cold War era, and there's still a fear about him being a progressive/communist. And therefore, if you go back and if you have the record, does anyone remember what his name is on the record? No, Charlie and the MTA, but fight the fare increase, vote for George O'Brien. Okay? There is no George O'Brien. Okay? It's Walter. But they didn't want anyone to go back and go, the song is about Walter O'Brien, and therefore they made that little change there, but the song is very much the same, and it was written by two Boston women. Okay, next. Oh, this is a long one. Okay. Many literati frequented Elizabeth Peabody's foreign bookstore, which once stood on West Street, and that's just a few blocks down. Name the resident writer-philosopher who mused, I now know all the people worth knowing in America, and I find no intellect comparable to my own. I love that. Anyone. Someone with a very small ego. Emerson? Do you think Emerson would say that? Nah. Okay. Here's the long-winded answer. Okay, next slide. First, I want to show you Elizabeth Peabody. Elizabeth Peabody was of the Peabody sisters. There's a new book out on the Peabody sisters. She never married herself, but she was the grande dame in a significant transcendentalist, abolitionist, women's rights advocate, and person who nurtured so many different people in the Boston area and Greater Boston in their literary pursuits. Her bookstore was a place where a variety of people, including the person who made that quote, who was Margaret Fuller, okay? Margaret Fuller would hold these conversations that really were the beginning of transcendentalism, because Margaret was a very good friend of Emerson's and helped develop the concepts of transcendentalism, was the editor of the Dial. Elizabeth Peabody paid for the financing of the Dial. She also paid, she let her bookshop be used for all these conversations where great philosophies came out. She gave Thoreau money to publish Civil Disobedience when that came out. She helped Marcin Alcott, Louisa May's father, run the Temple School and give financing and support for that. So she was very, very important. If you want to get a better sense of her character, go back and read Henry James' The Bostonians, and she's Miss Birdseye. Okay? He said, no, it's not. It's like, of course she is. Also, she was well connected by marriage, even though she didn't marry. One of her sisters married Nathaniel Hawthorne, okay? Considered one of the only happy marriages in literary history. And the other one married another person important in literature and education, Horace Mann, the great educator. So this was quite the extended family. Yes? No, that's Margaret Fuller. I'm talking about the Peabodys. Okay, now we'll get up. I'm sorry. I'm talking about too many women here. Okay, next slide. Here is Margaret, and this doesn't look like a woman who would be saying I'm the smartest person. Anyway, she was phenomenal. She... again, worked hand in hand with Emerson, was one of the proto-feminists. It wouldn't be appropriate to call her a feminist at that time yet, really, but she wrote this book, one of the books that came out of the conversation she held at Elizabeth Peabody's foreign bookstore was called Women in the 19th Century, which is considered a really important stepping stone in chronicling the accomplishments of women. And the next image, I think, is of her pal Emerson. A lot of men were intimidated by her because she was so smart and clearly didn't hide the fact that she was smart, and you just didn't do that in 1840 and 45. Not a good idea. But anyway, as you mentioned, okay, the next slide, She died young, and this is one of the reasons she died at the age of 40. And she was one of the first women journalists and went over to cover the various revolutions happening in the late 1840s in Italy, secretly married the Count Asoli. They had a child, and the three of them were coming back on a boat, and it ran aground at Fire Island. And Emerson was just upset. He went, "Margaret cannot be dead. This is impossible." And so he sent Thoreau out, because Thoreau was also a surveyor, to see if he could find anything of their remains, and they couldn't. They actually couldn't find the Count, her secret husband. They couldn't find Margaret. They did find the baby. So this is over at Mount Auburn Cemetery. It's a cenotaph for her and the Count, and a cenotaph is a tomb that memorializes someone, but the person isn't there. Okay, because in many cases they simply don't know where the person is, or they were buried on the battlefield or something, but the baby is buried there. But despite her early death, huge influence on history and on literature in Boston. Publishing entrepreneur James T. Fields of the Old Corner Bookstore was known for discovering and nurturing literary talent. What aspiring young author did he discourage and implore to, quote, stick to your teaching? Someone who had, yes? Thoreau, no, but that's a good guess, because Thoreau did in fact quit teaching, but partly because he didn't want to whip the kids. Anyone else? Was it Poe? No, Poe had already left. And he wouldn't have cared what anyone in Boston said. He called us frog pondians. Anyone else? Someone came to him with a manuscript. Yes. Longfellow? Nope. He was already teaching Romance languages at Harvard, way advanced. This was someone who wasn't quite known as a writer yet. It was a woman. Louisa May Alcott. Okay. Yes. Okay. So here's the story. Next picture. Okay, here's Louisa May. Louisa May was very much the girl, the Jo, that you all read in Little Women, or all the women here read, because how many of you guys have read Little Women? Really? How many of you guys? Oh, I'm sorry, that you thought it was a generic guys. Okay. Anyway, most women have read it, I find, whenever I talk, and fewer men. But she was very much the Jo in there. She was very much a person who loved doing plays, writing blood and thunder stories, and all kinds of things that actually preceded her being convinced to write the story of her own family, which was essentially, what happened in Little Women. But before that happened, she did go to James Fields. Now, the Old Corner Bookstore, which is diagonally across the street, by the way, I don't know if you've seen the recent signs, but a diamond store is going in on the base level. I find that upsetting. Okay, just a personal note. Oh, that's on record now, isn't it? Anyway, the Old Corner Bookstore during the 19th century was a phenomenal place for the nurturing of the literary revolution and the golden age of literature in the United States, which was centered in the Boston area, in Boston, Cambridge, and Concord. And particularly during 1845 to 1865, William Ticknor and James Fields ran it as Ticknor and Fields. And Ticknor was kind of the businessman, the nuts and bolts guy, and Jamie Fields was the star. He would get the authors in, become friends with them, take care of them, do tours for them, like they would go off on author tours and speak in auditoriums with thousands of people all around the United States. This predated rock concerts. And he also would write reviews under assumed names in the newspaper, write good reviews of his authors, and do whatever it took to get them out there. And he was really good at finding new talent and nurturing it. However, when this young Louisa May Alcott came in, and she was at the time teaching. She had many careers teaching. And he said, stick to your teaching. You can't write. And he loaned her $40. And said, why don't you use this to buy books and some chairs for your classroom and get back to what you can really do? Okay, then, next. This came out in 1868, what we would call a blockbuster today. Again, published to this day, made her and her family rich, supported everyone in the family, father, mother, kids, nephews, everybody, okay? After which she wrote a delightful letter to Jamie Fields, which is shown here. Dear Mr. Fields, Once upon a time, you lent me $40, kindly saying I might return them when I had made a pot of gold. As the miracle has been unexpectedly wrought, I wish to fulfill my part of the bargain, and herewith repay my debt with many thanks. Very truly yours, L.M. Alcott. I love that. I love that letter. So she thanked him, and they were friends thereafter. Okay. Now, regarding Louisa May Alcott, she is actually all over this trail. Now, the trail goes from downtown Boston. You can take it in small segments, in large segments, whatever. It starts in this area at the Parker House, comes down here, goes all the way through town, then over to Cambridge and Concord. Everyone associates this place with her, which is Orchard House in Concord, and it's an awesome place. And it feels like the Alcotts. It feels like Little Women. Many of the descriptions of the places, etc., are in this house, even though all the events happened at the house down from that, which is called the Wayside. So she kind of mixed up her myth and reality. But you can still go here, see the desk she wrote on, see, rooms with decorations and drawings and artwork by her sisters, and it's a marvelous place to visit. But she's got sites everywhere. For example, over on Louisburg Square, right across from Carrie and Hines. Okay, directly across the street from their house is the place that she and her dad lived. She did take care of her dad. He was brilliant, but not terribly good at supporting the family, but she was. And they both actually had a residence there, and in 1888, both Louisa May and her father, Bronson Alcott, died while they were living in Louisburg Square, 2 days apart from each other. What was also curious is their birthday was the same day. Not the same year, but the same day. So that's kind of, I don't know, interesting. Obviously, she died younger as well. Okay, next. Now, I love this image. This is from my favorite 19th century photographer, Julia Margaret Cameron. And this is actually a portrait of James T. Fields. And again, he was totally pivotal in the development of American literature. Not only did he get all these amazing people to come to the Old Corner Bookstore, I should say at that time, it wasn't just a bookstore, it was a publishing house. They didn't have publishing houses in America like we know today. So a bookstore might sell the books, sign the authors, publish the books, print the books, or get them printed over at the Riverside Press across the river in Cambridge. And they would do that all in one. So even though it was called a bookstore, it was a publishing house. So not only did Jamie bring people in, promote them, whatever, on any given day you might see Thoreau, I'm trying to think who else would come in and out, Longfellow, Emerson, Hawthorne, etc., Harriet Beecher Stowe, would be coming in and out of there, and he would be nurturing them and being great to them. But also very important and less touted was his wife. Next picture. Annie Adams, who became Annie Adams Fields. Now, Annie contributed to literature because she not only wrote about her friends, and many letters that she wrote and were published in books tell us much about the personal life and personal anecdotes about people, like, how when Charles Dickens visited, he was clowning around and fell into a bathtub, making everybody laugh very hard, and just what people, how people got along, how Longfellow liked Hawthorne and how Hawthorne liked Melville, and all these wonderful anecdotes. But she also held salons, and they had a house down on Charles Street. You know where the Charles Street parking lot is? Down towards the Circle? If you walk behind that and sneak in, it's a private parking lot, and look over the fence, you can see a garden in there. That was Annie's garden. That was where she and Jamie Fields had their garden, and that's still there today, but their house is torn down in a parking lot. But anyway, she would run these salons where famous people of literature and theater and the arts, whatever, would come and talk together at their Charles Street house. Now, curiously, she was also at the forefront of a phenomena that's distinctly Bostonian, which is that in 1881, after a long marriage to Jamie Fields, he was about 15 years older than her, and he died. And so someone moved in right after that in the next picture. Another author named Sarah Orne Jewett, who you may know, she's a Maine author. One of her most famous books was The Country of the Pointed Firs. And they proceeded to live together for the rest of their lives. And this was called a Boston marriage. Okay, so do you want to tell about Boston marriages? Okay, which was a uniquely Boston situation that was happening in the Victorian era, curiously in Boston. And that was that two women would get together and live as a married couple and would entertain together, would travel together, and be accepted as a couple. And no one batted an eyelash. And so her relationship with Jamie was replaced by her relationship with Sarah Orne Jewett, and they continued to have authors, men, women, etc., come in and host these and keep on the literary salons thereafter. One of their proteges was a young would-be writer who thought the two women were phenomenal and wrote a lot about them, a young writer called Willa Cather. So, again, we have all of these connections and meeting places. Now, is it or is it not a coincidence that Oh, by the way, this is a really bad picture. Sorry I couldn't get a better one of them in their salon. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. has a lot of descriptions about how it was so delightful to visit these two women and become a part of their literary lives. Okay, next picture. Is it a coincidence that Boston, the home of the Boston marriage, is the same place where May 17th last year we had another revelation, which is the legalization of gay marriage? Now, Boston marriages and gay marriages may not necessarily be the same thing, or then again they might be, we don't know. Okay? Nobody's telling who did what with whom. However, it's a rather radical thing that only happened in Boston then and happened in Massachusetts now. And this, the next image here, the State House, a great place, is the couple, the Goodridges, who were at the heart of the Supreme Court, Supreme Judicial Court case making marriage legal for gays in Massachusetts. Okay? Now, this is, I'm out of time. Darn. Okay. But perfect that this slide should come up. This is the proverbial tip of the iceberg. I've only alluded to maybe, 1/100th of the stories that are in here. I just want to give you just a quick thing to look at, okay? So, number one, that we have stories and tours in Boston, okay, which you can take in and of themselves or move on from there. It moves on to Cambridge. There are walking tours and driving tours there. And then it moves on to Concord and talks about the interconnectedness of the three. Okay. And there are stories about the Boston Athenaeum and the various people who work there, many of them famous people who, writers that you know in our household words such as Emerson, Hawthorne, Longfellow, and the story about why he grew his beard, I won't tell you. Also stories about radical women like Lydia Maria Child, who you may remember because of her little song poem, Over the River and Through the Woods, but was thrown out of the Athenaeum or found that her privileges were revoked when she wrote a strident abolitionist tract called An Appeal in Favor of that class of Americans called Africans. And she was a little early in her desire for freedom and was excused from the Athenaeum. So wonderful people like that sharing the stage. The African Meeting House, a major place for African American authors, writers, speakers, orators, stories about those. Tales about the Underground Railroad and how various authors were a lot of